Be honest. When's the last time you read Numbers? Well, don't worry. You can count on us to talk about it on this week's episode of The Grain Offering.
Hey, let's spend some time in God's holy word, looking for a sign in God's holy word. So let's start hearing those stories new and old from these two brothers. Hot takes and beer that's cold, they go together like pasta and meatballs. They're undeterred, bringing you God's holy word. Holy word. It's a grain offering, bringing you God's holy word.
All right, Jeff, what are we doing here? Why the grain offering? Why the book of Numbers?
Yeah, well, the answer to your first one is we both went to seminary. We both like talking about the Bible. We both enjoy each other's company, I guess. So we decided to start this little experience adventure called the Grain Offering. And the Grain Offering actually comes from Leviticus, which we talked about last episode. It talks about the instructions for how to prepare the grain offering to present to God. And since beer is brewed from grain and we consume beer while we talk about the Bible, this whole experience, this whole conversation is our grain offering. So that's why we're calling it the Grain Offering. Why the book of Numbers? Because we had to do it, I guess. I mean, it's we did the Pentateuch, or we're in the middle of the Pentateuch, and Numbers is part of the Pentateuch, so we kind of have to do it, I guess.
That's a good enough answer for me.
Yeah. I mean, like, to be honest, like the question that I asked at the very beginning of the episode, it's kind of true in a little bit of a sense, because like Numbers is not one of those books you're just like, oh yeah, I'm gonna read Numbers and it's gonna be like great and I'm gonna learn so much about God. It's like,
Yeah.
I mean,
The irony, I think, is that, and we're maybe getting ahead of ourselves in this, but the irony with the book of Numbers is I think a lot of people know stories from the book of Numbers, but if you were to ask them, is this a story from the book of Numbers? I don't know if they'd be able to say yes.
yeah, that's totally true. Because like as I was putting together the just the outline for the episode today, like I was reminded, I was like, oh yeah, this story's in Numbers. Oh yeah, this story's in Numbers. Because I think in my mind, we talked about it on Leviticus last time, Jeremy, but that was Leviticus doesn't really have any main stories. Like it's just a bunch of laws, right? But I always get Leviticus and Numbers mixed up, because like the stories that happen in Numbers, I'm just like, oh yeah, that happens as Leviticus as they're wandering through the wilderness, but it's
Right.
it's not. So
Right, because you think sequentially.
yes. Yeah.
That that's just where the story goes.
Right.
Next. Yeah. I hear you on that. Well, before we get to talking about Numbers, I have serious business question for you.
Okay.
What beer are you drinking today?
So today, I've done a lot of like digging into what beers would pair best for the books that we're studying and stuff like that. And for today's beer, I'm actually not that excited about it. Simply because like it's a type of beer, it's a style of beer that I personally don't like. Yeah, I'm not very excited about it. So today I have a Lindman's Creek Cherry Lambic beer. It's a sour beer. For those of you at home, if you're interested. I'm not a huge fan of sour beer, but as I was looking at Numbers, Numbers talks about Israel coming to the cusp of the promised land, scouting it out, coming back and like, oh, we can't inherit it. There's a bunch of giants. So the idea being like they were there, they could see the sweetness, but they made it sour for themselves. So they took something that was perfectly good and made it sour. So that's exactly why I chose this sour beer. So
Very, very theologically driven, I must say.
That's exactly why I went to seminary, just to figure out what beers would
pair your beers.
Bible,
yeah.
So
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I did something very, very similar. I went for what was in the fridge.
Mm-hmm.
So today I have an Anchorstein, specifically a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year
Oh,
Anchorstein.
nice.
Don't know when you're listening to this. Maybe it's Christmas. Merry Christmas.
uh, yeah, if they're listening to it to Christmas, Merry Christmas 2021. Thankfully, the pandemic is behind us now. Hopefully, we don't
Knock
know.
on wood. Don't jinx it.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So, Jeremy, I'm sensing a little bit of a pattern here with your beer choices that they're kind of rustic is the right word. I don't know. What word would you? Convenient, maybe.
Rustic is a good word for it.
I see. I see.
Cannot say that it is intentional, but it is there.
Okay. So I'm gonna put a poll down in the comments down below of who do you think has the better beer choices. So we'll get a poll going and see how many people vote on that. But without any further ado, Jeremy, let's crack open these beers and get this episode going. Oh,
there we go.
Another reason to hate sour beer. I popped the top on it. It has a cork in it. But thankfully, I have my handy dandy little bottle opener that also has a. So, Jeremy, please go ahead and enjoy your beer while I struggle to get this.
All right. Clink. There you go.
Clink. All right. As the Germans say, Prost.
That's true. They do say that.
I'm almost there. I'm almost there. Okay, you ready to hear this? Oh, that wasn't that impressive.
Yeah, that was not impressive. So this is kind of like the Book of Numbers, right? Like, you look into it, you look into the beer, you see that it's there, but then you can't have it right away.
Yeah, it's not great, but it's also not terrible. This is actually not.
Neither is Moses.
You're really leaning into the theology of my beer choice this week.
I just want to, keep up with you on that front.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's not bad, but it's not great. I mean, yeah. So, all right, Jeremy, let's get to the overview of.
Yeah, it's about time.
Yeah, it's about time. Enough of a stupid beer opening.
Yeah, enough of us just messing around.
Yeah,
just like
we must get to the word of the Lord at some point, right?
Yeah, at some point.
Man, I love doing the show with you, by the way, just FYI. All right, so the Book of Numbers is the fourth book in the Pentateuch. Again, the author is thought to have been Moses, simply because it's thought that Moses has written the entirety of the Pentateuch. We've talked about kind of the problematic view of that, and that's where we're coming from. So in case you're interested in what we have to say about that, I think that's in our very first episode of Genesis that we talked about.
I mean, it's probably in the Genesis episode, the Exodus episode, the Leviticus episode,
and it'll definitely be in the Deuteronomy episode.
Yeah. So check those out.
Yeah, check them out. Okay, so it's thought that the author is Moses. The date written, again, kind of problematic, but a lot of historians and theologians kind of agree that it's in and around 1440 BC. And the Book of Numbers actually covers just a 50-year time span between 1450 and 1400 BC. And the famous stories, because again, we try to highlight the famous stories that are in each book. Leviticus doesn't have any. Numbers, there's three main stories that are kind of I don't know if you would say like the Sunday school classics, but certainly the stories that come to mind when somebody thinks about the Book of Numbers. And that is chapter 13. We have the spies, the Israelite spies, who go out into the land and come back and report the fact that there's these creatures called the Nephilim that are wandering around. 10 of the 12 spies that go out come back and say like, oh no, we can't inherit the land, it's too dangerous. And the other two are just like, what are you talking about? God's with us, like we can do this. And then chapter 20, Moses strikes the rock twice, which may seem kind of like a silly detail to include, but it actually has very, very massive repercussions for Moses's life. So we'll talk about that when we get there. And then finally, probably one of my favorite stories in the entirety of the Old Testament, chapter 22, we have Balaam's donkey. So Balaam's donkey, again, we'll get there and talk about it when the time comes. But yeah, those are the three major stories that come from, or the three most famous stories, I should say, that come from the Book of Numbers. And the Book of Numbers itself can kind of be broken down into three kind of big story arcs. Because again, we've been talking about how these books break down into major story arcs. I've told you this before, Jeremy, but I am much more of a what's called a meta narrative person, where I kind of like to take the 30,000 foot view of whatever we're studying and kind of see the major things going on. Book of Numbers, three major storylines. Number one, preparing the Israelites to inherit the promised land, which is in chapters 1 through 10. Then we have the falling away from the plan. Spoiler alert: Israel doesn't follow God's plan. That's chapters.
Surprise, surprise.
Yeah, surprise, surprise. That's chapters 11 through 14. And then the God's response slash the Lord's discipline of Israel comprises pretty much the majority of the book, verses or chapters 15 to 36. So the Lord's punishment and discipline of Israel is actually like more than half the book. So there's something there that we're going to talk about. But yeah, those are the three big story arcs. Those are the three big things going on in the Book of Numbers. And yeah, so let's dive into these big questions, Jeremy. So for the first section of preparing the Israelites to inherit the promised land, they're coming through their wilderness wandering. They get to the cusp of the promised land, and God says, okay, go scout it out. And the scouts go out. And what's interesting to me is that they report back that it's, flowing with milk and honey, that it's extremely fertile, that it's like ideal for raising families and cows and all these things. Like it's the perfect land. It's everything that God had promised that it would be.
Yeah.
But there's giants. There's something keeping them from like really envisioning themselves there. Like uh-oh. Like it's really cool, but that. So we're going to talk about it because Nephilim are weird. But
what's weird about Nephilim?
Well, first of all, if anybody watching this can explain to me in great detail what Nephilim are, I will be better for it, because I really don't know too much about the Nephilim. I know that they're referred to in the Book of Numbers as giants, or a giant creature, or a giant human-like creature, I should say. But other than that, I really don't know, because I mean, well, let's put it this way too. When the Romans were conquering the world, when they came across some of the Germanic tribes, they also described them as giants. But that's because like the Germanic people, their average height I think was like 6 feet or up. So to the Roman, who was 5'8", they are giant. They are like pretty tall. Whether or not that's what the Nephilim were, I don't know. But that's kind of what's going on. So they scout out the promised land. They come back and just like, oh, it's great, but we can't have it.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where they are. So the big question I have for you, Jeremy, is why couldn't Israel simply just inherit the land?
I mean, I don't know if I have a good answer for you.
You have a answer, but
I certainly do have an answer. I mean, the kind of face value answer is because they don't trust God, right? Like they don't have faith that God is delivering on their promise, or they don't have faith that God will hold up his end of the bargain, is another way to say that, right?
Yeah.
They see the land, they see that it's good, they see that it's flowing with milk and honey, but it's still an element of they want it to be inherited on their terms, right?
Yeah.
Like they see that there's a minor hiccup in the plan. They're like, oh, well, we can't do it. Like if
Right.
It's not the most simple, straightforward thing to do, we can't do it.
Right.
So that's a response.
Yeah. No, and I actually think that that's kind of an accurate portrayal of what's going on. Because I mean, if you think about it, what you just described is exactly what Israel's experience has been the entire time they've been in the wilderness. I mean, even from the time that they came out of Egypt, like actually even before, now that I think about it, even before they enter into the wilderness, they get to the Red Sea and they see Pharaoh's army pursuing them. They're like, Moses, why'd you bring us out here to die? Like, what? We had everything we wanted in Egypt. Like, yeah, we were slaves, but at least we had like safety. But you see this pattern repeated time and time and time and time and time again throughout the wilderness of, oh, we don't trust God. We're hungry. Okay, well, we like the manna, but we want quail. We want food. We want protein. Like, God, and then we talked about it too. Like God's response, like, okay, I'm going to give you so much quail, it's going to come out of your nose. So he gives them bread. He gives them manna. He gives them quail. He gives them water. He takes care of them. He gives them places to stay and protection. And God constantly is taking care of Israel throughout the wilderness wandering. And again, they come up to the promised land and they see that it is good. And yet they see that hiccup, like you said. And it's just all of a sudden just like, oh, well, we can't do it. Whoops. Like, so, I mean, it's not, unfortunately, it's not surprising that Israel was, you know?
Right. They definitely, Israel occupies the same kind of spot in the story time and time again. So.
Yeah. Now, why do you think, I mean, getting back to the question itself, like you gave an answer, but let's kind of dig a little bit deeper there. Like, why couldn't Israel just walk into the promised land and inherit it? Like, what was so bad about these Nephilim that prevented them? Because like after this, they don't go into the promised land right away. They like keep wandering for a little bit.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean, so this does bring up your question of Nephilim, in a sense. The first mention of Nephilim is not in Numbers, but in Genesis. The sons of God taking wives from the sons of Adam, and procreating. Now, the Nephilim, you brought up the kind of historical approach of like a Roman seeing a Germanic tall person is going to be like, oh, they're pretty big, like they're pretty giant.
Yeah.
But there is a bigger story element here than I think pure height difference. And I think that can be found in pulling on the main mentions of the Nephilim that we have in our canonized Bible, which are Genesis, the first mention of sons of God taking daughters of Adam, daughters of man, and procreating. The Nephilim in the Promised Land, and then the most famous Nephilim of them all, Goliath, right?
Yeah.
What we see just under the surface is ancient Near Eastern kings claiming to have divine origin, right?
Yeah.
And all of the principles and powers that come with that. So there are some bases of scholars who identify the Nephilim as purely Canaanite kings claiming to be God, right?
Yeah.
Canaanite kings, Canaanite leaders claiming to have greater power than they do. Right. Which, to the Israelites, they're coming from a land where the king claimed to be of divine origin, Pharaoh.
Yeah.
Pharaoh is a god.
Yeah.
To the Egyptians. So they've come from a land that has just been shown to them where that king is not God. That king is not in charge. That divine appointment is not in charge.
Right. And that God has power over that particular pantheon as well.
Correct.
Yeah.
So part of the mistrust, part of the unfaith, part of the, if you want to say sin of Israel in this story, is immediately forgetting what God has done for the Israelites in Egypt by seeing the promised land, seeing that it's good, seeing Nephilim, seeing kings, seeing leaders claiming to be God, and saying, essentially, God, your power must end here.
Right. This is the border of your power.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, no, I was going to say that I was actually reading through the prophet Amos earlier today, and spoiler alert: the prophets don't have anything very kind to say about Israel. But one of the things that struck me is that Amos, time and time again, mentions, he's speaking on behalf of God, and he says that God says this all the time, and that is, remember that I am the one who brought you up out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So even generations and generations and generations and generations down the road, God is still reminding Israel, hey, remember what I did for you in Egypt.
Yeah.
And that actually is a perfect segue into our next section on Numbers. And again, falling away from the plan in chapters 11 through 14. The reason why they fall away from the plan is because they're scared. They scout the land, they see the Nephilim, and they're scared. And they say, we rather just go somewhere else. So that's what they do. They wander around for a little bit more. And the question I have for us, Jeremy, is, I feel like we could ask this question of any book in the Old Testament. But the question is, why does Israel suffer from short-term memory? Or short-term memory loss, I should say.
Yeah, I mean, I'll answer your question with another question.
Classic.
Why do we suffer with short-term memory loss?
Come on, dude. That's where I was going to go with it.
Right? Like,
yeah.
The story of Israel is the story of us, right?
Although that is also problematic in and of itself, but
sure. Oh, okay, I'll say this then. The story of Israel is the story of humanity.
There you go. That's a much better one.
The Exodus is the story of the Israelites getting out of Egypt, and the rest of the Bible is about Egypt getting out of the Israelites.
Say that one more time. That's a really good line.
All right. Well, I'm gonna say that I'm pulling it from Rob Bell. So, so cast your stones now, sinners. Should get that on a shirt.
Dude, that should be our first merch drop.
Yeah. So yeah, again, the Exodus is the story of Israel getting out of Egypt, and the rest of the Bible is the story of Egypt getting out of Israel. Which, when we really break it down, the Exodus is the story of people in bondage being freed from their ties, freed from their chains.
Yeah.
And as a white man, I can't really talk too much of being chained up. I can't talk too much of the ways I've been marginalized and held down and commodified by the powers that be.
Right.
So I don't want to make it seem like, again, that it's just some big metaphor, because it's not. We're talking about real people in real places being marginalized and then being set free by God.
Yeah.
And there's a very deep truth to this matter. We fall back on the things we want to, or the things we don't want to be, right? And I think we've talked about this in previous episodes as well, but it's easy to fall back on what we know, even when what we know is bondage, what we know is chains, what we know is Egypt.
Right. And I think, like, a stupid metaphor, and granted, you've been really great at, like, giving us, like, these really big, deep things to chew on, and I'm gonna just throw a super like superficial metaphor out there.
Let go and let God.
No. Oh God, No, the metaphor that comes to mind is like a gym membership. Like just because you have a gym membership doesn't mean you're all of a sudden going to be healthy. Like being healthy requires a lifestyle change. But we
Yeah.
often revert back to like, oh well, mac and cheese, burgers, sweets, like why go to the gym? Why live into this new reality that is before me when I can just do what I know and what's comfortable,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. What's easy?
Yeah, exactly. What's easy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up because I think that that's the point of the question was to kind of get past the, wait a second, this is about me. Because it's so true. It is very true. Like and I'm so glad you mentioned the idea of bondage and stuff like that, because again, as brothers, we grew up in a white space. We don't know what it's like to experience bondage or slavery or oppression or any of that. So I get very I break out in hives when especially white evangelicals will say like, we've been set free by the Lord. It's just like, yeah, we have, but I think you're fundamentally misunderstanding what that freedom means.
Yeah.
But I think there is a level to it that also includes well, what's coming to mind is that one of my theology professors at Fuller talked about it's not freedom from, it's freedom for that we find in God, where it's not freedom. It is freedom from slavery, but it's freedom for living the way that God has intended us to live.
It's like
which
Romans.
is, yeah, exactly. And even Paul himself says, like, I was once a slave to sin, now I'm a slave of righteousness. I'm a slave of Christ. So just like you're swapping one set of bondage for another, but the chains of righteousness that you put on, like Jesus says, like, my burden is light,
Yeah.
Like what you do with me is you're going to find life and have it to the full. Like that's
Yeah.
what, so yeah, I think the short-term memory thing is something that comes up a lot in the story of Israel, but it also comes up a lot in our own history. I mean, you think about, we just got through doing Christmas a couple months ago. And one of the things that always comes up for me is this feeling of like, I open a present, I'm like, oh, this is great, but what's next? Like what's the next thing? What's the next thing that I'm going to open, And
well,
I think
that might just be the 7 in you.
that's true. That is very much the 7. The next best gift is the one that will fulfill all the needs that I have.
Yeah, always.
Yikes. But the idea of, what's next? What's the next thing? We do that with God all the time. It's like, okay, God, I know you delivered me from that, but are you going to deliver me from this? Like, I know you were faithful then, but are you going to be faithful here? Like, all of a sudden, when it comes to the reality of our situation, we start to question if God will do what God has done all along. Just like, I know you were faithful back then, but I'm not quite sure you're going to be faithful now,
Yeah.
So we kind of get in this spiritual rut, I guess.
Yeah.
So, okay. Now the last part of Numbers is comprised of, I don't know, what's 15 to 36. How many chapters is that? 15. I'm terrible at math. Plus 6. 21 chapters?
Sure.
Yeah.
Book of Numbers, you should know.
Yeah, 21 chapters. So I see what you did there. So the last part of Numbers consists of God's discipline of Israel for falling away from the plan. And I think it's worth saying, again, the biblical authors don't make mistakes in what they include. They do these things for a reason. So whenever you see a big chunk of chapters like this, you got to be like, maybe there's something there that we need to pay attention to. So the last 21 chapters of Numbers consists of God's discipline. And the question I have for us is God being too harsh with Israel? Because, I mean, they get punished pretty badly. Moses striking the rock twice, that basically prevents him from seeing the promise or from entering the promised land.
Yeah.
And it seems a little harsh.
Yeah, I guess so. Like what, where's the grace of God in this situation? Like, okay. let's talk about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like maybe the grace of God is in the fact that he saved you from slavery in Egypt, right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
like didn't have to. He could have just been chilling in like, the world and just been like,
Yeah.
they can handle it, right? So maybe the grace of God isn't there. Maybe it's in that God doesn't leave them at all, right? like,
Mhm.
like
Like he was
there's
going to, because
oh
remember
yeah,
when the golden calf episode in Exodus, God's just like, okay, I promise that I'd give you the promised land, so go ahead, I'm going to stay here. Like God almost was like, nope, I'm good.
Yeah, and I want to also bring into the scope too that like the way God acts in the Old Testament, specifically the Pentateuch, right,
Mm-hmm.
is very functionally how gods act in the ancient Near East,
Mm-hmm.
with the caveat that the God of Israel is different.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So I don't want it to seem like there's this big bait and switch between Old Testament God and the New Testament Jesus, right?
Yeah.
Because they are one and the same.
Yes.
And yet the people writing the Old Testament and telling these stories understand God in a different like Greco-Romanized way, right? Like they do in the New Testament. So we have to Hellenize. That's the word I should have said.
Nice.
So I want to be careful of that. But like, is God being too harsh on the Israelites? As an Israelite, you probably say yes.
Oh, of course, yeah.
As a reader of the story, you probably say no, they're being dumb, right?
And that's the thing. Like, if you're in the middle of being disciplined, like, I doubt any child who's being disciplined is gonna be like, you know what, thank you, mom and dad, for I really see the errors of my way, and
Right.
this is a fair judgment. Like, no, that's like not it.
So it's this weird balancing act of like, is God too harsh? No. Why? Because God is God, right? Like, there's so many niche stories in the Old Testament where especially Moses goes up to God and says, hey God, you're wanting to like kill all these people now, but that doesn't sound like you. And God's like, you know what, you're right, that doesn't sound like me, I'll only like wipe out half of them. Right. So there's this playful interaction that the storytellers are unveiling. That I tend to go to a place of interpreting as almost more manipulation on Moses's part, which falls into the ancient Near Eastern tradition of pulling on the strings of God to get a specific outcome, right? Which does stand in contrast to the idea of God will provide everything. You don't manipulate God.
Right.
But also it's awfully suspicious when Moses is like, but God, like for your namesake, not for the Israelites, they're terrible, but for your namesake, like don't forget like how good you are. And God's like, you know what, I am pretty good. So like we can't overlook that, but we also have to hold it in tension with a whole lot of other stuff.
Sure.
So for me at least, there's no direct answer to your question of is God being too harsh.
Right.
I think that question can pull on strings in the story that ultimately lead you down a path of just missing some of the larger intentions of the story.
And the question is also very subjective as well.
Yeah.
It's like, is God being true or harsh? Yeah. Like, God, if I was God, I wouldn't do like, but yes. And where I think I land on this question as well is actually one of the biggest lessons I learned about the book of Revelation. So hear me out on this. So
okay.
In Revelation, it talks about God's judgment finally being enacted upon the world, right? So we see, you know, a third of the world wiped out, a third of the stars, all this stuff, right? And I was leading a group of high schoolers through the book of Revelation not too long ago. And one of the questions that I asked was like, is God being unfair here? Like, is God just being unfair? And one of my freshman dudes, who I love the dude to death, he's like, if I was as smart as he was at my age, like, oh, I would have gone to like Oxford, like that. Like
at his age.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, at his age. Yeah, super smart, super like deep thinking, stuff like that. Shout out to Ian. But one of the things that he said was just like, no, I think what's going on is that we see that God's patience has a limit. And I was like, what do you mean? And he's just like, well, I mean, God has constantly warned people throughout the Bible of what happens when sin goes unchecked. And God is not going to allow it to happen forever. Like, God will stop it at some point. And Revelation is a story of God saying, like, enough is enough. So I think with Numbers and with the discipline of Israel, there's a similar thing going on where God is not going to let Israel just kick and scream and rebel for the sake of rebelling. Like, God will intervene and say, like, no, you must suffer the consequences of your choices. And again, that can be extremely problematic because like, oh, well, that doesn't sound like God. Like, yeah, but God is also a loving parent, and a loving parent doesn't allow a kid to do whatever the heck they want all the time. Like, there are boundaries. And I think in the story of Numbers, we see Israel crossing a boundary that God says, no, I'm going to correct you on this.
Yeah. I mean, and I think too, you know, to your point of, you know, but that doesn't sound like God, right?
Mm-hmm.
Jesus says a whole lot of stuff that doesn't sound like God.
Yeah.
Like, he says a whole lot of stuff that doesn't sound loving. To us, it doesn't sound like he's caring for his neighbor. To us, right?
Yeah.
You know, it's completely scandalous and unacceptable in certain terms for Jesus to tell the story of the wedding banquet where he sends out the invites. They all say, "Oh, we're busy." It's like, okay, well, your seat is gonna be replaced. And that's very unfair, right?
Yeah.
Like,
not only that, dude, but like the father who's throwing the banquet is just like, oh, they didn't respond. All right, go out and like just burn their villages.
Yeah, right. So like, there's a bunch of stuff like that where it's like, oh, that doesn't sound right. Like, God, or like Jesus calling you know, a woman like you're a dog, like who's
a Syrophoenician dog.
Yeah, you know, so I don't know. We want a really one-dimensional God who provides and cares for us and loves us unconditionally.
Mm-hmm.
And then we get all thrown out of whack when we humans who contain multitudes are shocked at God containing multitudes.
Yep. When God doesn't fit the narrative that we've written God into.
Right.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, that is a perfect way to kind of to wrap up. It's time for last call, Jeremy. So, last call. What are some closing thoughts you have on the Book of Numbers?
Book of Numbers, pretty underrated book. I think that there's a lot in there, a lot of profound stories that reverberate throughout the Bible. I mean, we didn't even talk about some of the best ones.
Right.
But yeah, Numbers is one of those where like go back and reread it. It's worth checking out.
Yeah. And for me, I agree. I think it's an underrated book. I think that we like the stories of Israel triumphing. Anyway, we love the stories of Israel winning battles against their enemies, but we kind of shy away from the ones where it's just like, oh, like Israel messed up, they have to be punished, they're like being sinful and stupid. Like, that doesn't make for a very good Sunday school story. So I think that Numbers is a reminder that God is still sovereign. God is still faithful. God still leads us to slay the giants in our life. Uh, so, yeah, I think that the book of Numbers is a good reminder that no matter what obstacle we face, God is still going to be faithful through it. So, all right, well, that is our thoughts on the book of Numbers.
Some thoughts.
Some thoughts.
Very few, but some.
Yeah. Just as a heads up for anybody who's made it this far into the episode. Next episode we will be wrapping up the Pentateuch, and we will be talking about the book of Deuteronomy. And it'll be the first episode that Jeremy and I will be doing in person with one another. So we're grateful for that. We're looking forward to that. Cracking open a beer and actually like making the clinking sound. And yeah, Jeremy, after the Pentateuch, where are we going?
I want to say some judges, man.
Some
Gonna straight start judging people. You come up to this podcast, leave an angry comment, get ready for the book of Judges. Like,
nice. All right. Well, yeah, we'll wrap up Deuteronomy next time, and then we're gonna hop into the book of Judges. So, Jeremy, grab your beer, and thank you everybody for watching. Like, subscribe, share, comment.
Smash that like button.
Smash that like button. Turn on the bell for notifications. Make sure you know exactly when we're. If you want to follow us, great. If not, that's fine too. So,
I'm pretty sure anyone who doesn't want to follow us has not made it this far to hear you say it's okay that you don't follow us.
That's fair. That's a fair point. All right. Well, thank you everybody for watching. Thanks for hearing us ramble about the book of Numbers, and we'll see you next time for the book of Deuteronomy. But until then, my name's Jeff.
I'm Jeremy.
And this has been our grain offering.